Josh Primo was the surprise of the 2021 NBA draft, so what is he really all about? This is Floor and Ceiling, let's break him down. Josh Primo out of Alabama was the youngest player in the 2021 NBA draft, not turning 19 until Christmas Eve. The San Antonio Spurs shocked the world by drafting Primo with the 12th overall pick, but behind that shock, the Canadian guard had genuinely put together a very solid season with the Crimson Tide. Primo was regarded as one of the breakout candidates in the 2022 draft, but his eruption came a year earlier. At 6'5" with a wingspan over 6'9", Primo has really interesting measurements for a guard, but he will gradually have to add to his really skinny frame in order to play NBA basketball. Josh Primo had a pretty simple offensive role most of the time for Alabama. More often than not, Primo's main responsibility was to space the floor, usually spotting up and staying ready in the corner. With the likes of Herb Jones, John Petty Jr., or Javon Quinterly on his team, Primo could not command a lot of touches. Largely, he played away from the ball, a role he later admitted that he was not used to before college. Primo made a bit over 38% of his threes, cashing in on 43 of his 113 attempted triples all season. 88% of Primo's threes were assisted, which shows the extent of how much he relied on his teammates for touches. Still, given Primo's fluid mechanics, decent volume at almost 4 threes taken per game, youth, and willingness to shoot, I'd buy his long-term potential from the outside. More than that, I like that Primo is now accustomed to playing in such a small role. At 12 in the draft, you want Primo to grow into more than a role player ideally, but the fact that he was already productive while being featured so little gives me hope that Primo will be effective no matter what. With that being said, Primo's 3 will be very important for him. Part of Primo's appeal is his youth, but that is also something that goes against him because of how raw he still is. Primo is in a really early stage of his development. If you complicate his role too much in the NBA early on, I'm not sure that is putting him in the best situation to succeed. Primo had a nice freshman season from beyond the arc, but the sample size was not that big. I also feel that he still has room to grow and improve as a catch-and-shoot player. In those situations, Primo can sometimes get a little rushed with his shot prep and release. Something to keep an eye on as well is Primo's tendency to kick his leg out on his shot. Luckily for Primo, should the Spurs see any big problems with his shot, San Antonio has arguably the best shooting coach in the league. Another skill off the ball that Primo adds value with is his cutting. At times during his only year in Alabama, Primo showed the ability to move intelligently away from the rock. He filled in little spaces, stayed engaged to receive the ball, and made sharp cuts when his defender fell asleep. I always like to see someone do the little things to help his team win, and Primo did a good job doing that throughout the season. Lastly, I want to focus on Primo's offensive rebounding. This is another area where Primo makes himself felt despite not having the ball in his hands. Primo only averaged 1 offensive board per game as a freshman, but I think he flashed decent potential crashing the boards. Even if Primo was not always able to convert on putbacks or things of that nature, I like that he was always attentive. Primo did not ball watch or sit on the perimeter while possessions unfolded. If he saw that a shot was not going in, he ran into the paint and did his best to get Alabama another possession. For instance, watch this clip as Primo shows off his high level of activity on the offensive glass. Before going into how Primo can also score, I want to keep stressing that Primo does not necessarily need to take or make a lot of shots in order to affect a game. As I will get into shortly, Primo is an exciting guard prospect, but he is also a good connector prospect. What I mean by that is that he can fill in around the floor. Primo can rebound hard on one possession and then act as a facilitator the next trip down the floor. You had to look hard during Alabama's season to find glimpses of Primo's passing, but they were there. Primo did not even average 1 assist per game, but again, I think that speaks more to his role than his skill set. At times, Primo showed some interesting flashes, mostly either getting to the paint and finding his big, or collapsing the defense and finding a 3-point shooter. I like that these are the types of passes you usually want from an NBA guard. Primo evidently has room to grow, but watch this pass here. In general, Primo had one of his best passing games against Missouri. He ended the night with just 1 assist, but that's because the looks Primo created were not going down. He was active all night scanning the floor and making the right decisions. Watch here as he gets the screen, draws 2 defenders over to him, and then simply hits the big for a good look. As promised, let's get into Primo's scoring. Primo averaged a quiet 8 points per game, but again he was usually the least showcased player on his own team whenever he was on the floor. In addition to his encouraging 3-point shooting that we saw earlier, Primo also took about 1/3 of his shots at the rim. As a freshman, he had some nice flashes getting downhill. Primo is a decent athlete when you talk about his first step, but I think he is more of a below-the-rim guy when he attacks the basket. However, he showed off some craft from time to time, with some clever finishes in traffic and over length. Still, finishing is another area that Primo must get more comfortable in. Primo made 60% of his shots at the rim. That's not bad for an 18-year-old, but it is also definitely improvable. Like I said, Primo is more of a below-the-rim athlete. He cannot jump over or power through defenders most of the time. This was already a problem in college, so I expect there to be a fairly considerable adjustment curve for Primo in the NBA. A lot of the time, he has the ability to get into the paint, but then lacks nuance or poise on his finishes. The game can still move too fast for Primo when he is up against stronger and bigger centers. If a defender really gets into Primo or he is met by size, then the Canadian guard can definitely be guilty of shrinking sometimes. Primo must get better at playing through contact and going up strong. As his 189-pound frame hopefully fills out, I expect some improvement to naturally happen. But one thing that adding weight and strength will not fix is Primo's inability to change directions as a ball handler. Primo is pretty rigid as a decision maker right now. This mostly showed up in transition at Alabama, but I expect him to also have problems just generally trying to shake his defenders. Primo clearly has some bounce in his step, but he lacks creativity. He does not have a Euro step, a side step, or really anything in his arsenal that allows him to contort into small spaces. Time and time again as a freshman, Primo struggled to slow down and either change direction or speed. The good news is that he has a lot of time to work on this, but the bad news is that he is essentially starting from scratch. Watch here as Primo cannot create the separation that he is looking for. The same notion largely applies to Primo's handle as well. Primo has played on the ball most of his life, but it did not always look that way at the college level. He needs to continue working on his handle in multiple ways. First, Primo can sometimes just be a bit loose and high taking care of the ball. Second, Primo once again lacks creativity. He does not have any signature moves or counter moves. Essentially, his handle is too basic. And because his handle is so basic, Primo cannot use it to consistently create separation. He'll go up against defenders that he should be able to beat, but stump himself because his handle is in such an early developmental stage. On that same note, let's quickly revisit Primo's passing. I mentioned that the flashes were there if you looked, which remains true, but without really looking, the turnovers were a lot more noticeable. Primo had 41 turnovers to his 25 total assists. That is a terrible ratio. And as we can see versus Alabama, Primo can still have a tough time acting as a primary decision maker. In Summer League action so far, Primo has had 4 more turnovers than assists. Looking towards the future, developing him as a passer will definitely be a point of emphasis for the Spurs. The same thing goes for Primo's development creating his own shot. We've already seen glimpses of this in a San Antonio uniform, but Primo really needs to become more self-reliant. Right now, this is still hard for him on a consistent basis. Primo's role at Alabama did not have him look for his own shot too often, but the results when he did were not that good. I cannot stress enough how green Primo still is, and how that is a two-way street. If you need instant production from him right now, that's probably a no-go, but you see the glimpses of what he could look like a few years down the line. Ideally, these are the types of possessions that Primo will be able to put together in, let's say, 3 years. It seems clear to me that the Spurs envision Primo playing with the ball in his hands a lot more. As I've mentioned in other videos, Primo did some of that at the NBA Draft Combine, but he also had a few nice moments at Alabama. Watch here, for example, as he calls for the ISO and drains the pull-up. Defensively, I like Josh Primo quite a bit, both regarding where he's at right now and his projection down the line. Primo is a smart, capable defender who plays with great effort on this end of the floor. Watch here, for example, as he executes the switch seamlessly, chases around the screen, and bothers the shot without fouling. Or here, Primo has a really complete possession. First, he fights to avoid the handoff, then he again switches perfectly and rotates to bother the shot. Finally, Primo fights for the rebound and then stays vertical to come up with the block. I find it easier to discuss Primo's defensive contributions with clips, so watch here as he first helps in the paint, remains alert to chase out to the perimeter, and then executes the closeout to force the air ball. If there's one thing that embodies Primo on defense, it's effort. He does not mind making multiple efforts within a play. Whether that means rotating, closing out, or working to stay in front of the attacker, Primo does it all. He is a diligent worker who can genuinely make his opponents uncomfortable. Primo has solid size and pretty good length, especially if he ends up playing as the 2 guard on his team. Primo can really compete, and he gets after it on this side of the basketball. He is good at fighting over screens, staying attached to plays, and contesting. Watch here as Primo quickly helps on the drive, comes back out to stay in front of BJ Boston, and then plays a role in forcing the turnover. Lastly, Primo also had some solid moments in the passing lanes. He did well anticipating and pouncing on loose balls or errant passes, as is the case here. Or watch against Kentucky as Primo is the first to Isaiah Jackson's bad pass and then goes on to start the fast break. Versus Mizzou, it's another good sequence as Primo is highly active flying all around the floor, helps on the post touch here, and then gets back to deflect the ball out. Overall, I think that Primo has the tools to be an impactful defender with his length, feel, and defensive toughness. I'm bullish on that, but he desperately does need to get stronger. I've mentioned this a number of times now, but it's true, Primo is still very thin with narrow shoulders, even though he plays with great effort that cannot always make up for how frail he is. As a result, sometimes opponents will just go through him and he won't be able to contain them. For example, that happens here. I buy Primo's defensive upside, but this is one area where he will have to depend on the weight room to see better results that line up with his feel and effort. Alright, so this was definitely one of the more interesting videos that I've done for the channel, and I think that's for a number of reasons. The first one being obviously that this was sort of a retrospective look. Primo has already been drafted by the Spurs. As I said, it was a surprise of the night. But now that he's in San Antonio, I sort of have an idea of how they want to use him. So going off the stuff that Primo has shown in the Summer League, given off some of the comments that the Spurs have made in recent times, I sort of have a clue of how San Antonio wants to develop Primo. And looking at that, going back to his college tape, well, it was definitely a big adjustment because his role at Alabama is completely different to the one that he's shown so far in the NBA. At Alabama, you could envision Primo becoming sort of a 3-and-D guard, I guess sort of in the mold of Jaden Springer if you want to compare him to a college prospect. But now that he's finally in the league after being drafted, it really seems like San Antonio wants to develop Primo on the ball. Like I said in the video, he's shown some flashes on the ball, but at the end of the day, he is such an incredibly raw prospect there. Primo was much better off the ball at Alabama. Of course, that's because his role was mainly to play off the ball. But even when he had those reps on the ball, he still struggled at times. He has to get much better getting downhill, he has to become a more creative finisher, and he really needs to develop his handle if he is to play as a guard. Still, I thought that there was a lot to like about Primo. First of all, his size at 6'9" with a wingspan over 6'9", I really think that's quite good for a 2 guard. He's shown some flashes, obviously as a shooter, 38% from deep. I think he has a fluid, clean shot. He maybe needs to clean it up a little bit, but I trust that he will get there. And I thought that he showed enough as a self-creator to give you some hope. Finally, on defense, I expect Primo to continue developing really well in San Antonio. He already showed off quite a bit in Alabama. He's quick, he's light on his feet, he gets down in a stance, and just to quickly go back to him being light on his feet, I mentioned Jaden Springer earlier. Well, I think that sets Primo apart from him. Springer is more of a heavy guy, sort of a guy that really loves to go off 2 feet only, whereas Primo can really, I think, fly around the floor, sort of move more fluidly and more cleanly. However, I think that Primo will need a lot of investment in San Antonio. Picking him at 12 was a risk, and in hindsight, I had Primo more as a late first round, early second round type of guy heading into the draft. I think now, after really having dived into his tape, I would probably keep him in that late first round area. Probably in the 20 to 30 picks, I would not mind having drafted him there. But the Spurs took a risk picking him at 12, and now it's up to them to make good on that. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, make sure to leave a comment telling me what you think of Josh Primo. And if you enjoyed the channel, if you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time.